BBC 5 Live.
We're talking about chronic fatigue syndrome, also known as ME. Were you aware that around 250,000 people in the UK have it? Symptoms include tiredness, headaches, chronic muscle pain. But patients complain the condition isn't always taken seriously by employers, friends, or even medical professionals. Are we over the time when it was just called yuppie flu? Do you remember that? That was the phrase that was attached to ME. And in fact, I was reading an article from just 7 years ago where that was mentioned, and people were questioning whether it was in fact a thing or not. Well, if you are someone who suffers the symptoms of chronic fatigue syndrome, also known as ME, then you will know it's very much a thing. Gary Burgess is our guest takeover man today. He was reporting on live TV when he says his body shut down. Now, that was in January 2017, and he's not completed a full day's work since. It took him 286 days to get a diagnosis for ME. Now, just to be clear, this isn't just feeling a little bit tired and run down. We all get that. This is something far more serious. And perhaps some people think, oh, wow, I'm feeling a little bit tired, a little bit drained. Maybe it's ME. Trust me, when you hear what Gary has to say and how it affected his life, you won't think of it as ME again. He set up an online support group called Zonked Club, and Gary is taking over this hour of the show. Welcome to 5 Live, Gary.
Thank you, Nihal. How are you?
Good. Let's start by telling me about today. What has today been like?
Today has been an okay day because I knew you were. It's all about you. You were the focus of my day this hour, so I've cleared everything around it. I went out for a short stroll and a cup of coffee with a friend this morning, but even that, with hindsight, was actually one thing too much. By the time I got home an hour later, I just collapsed on the sofa and then actually went for a little lie down because my body really did feel like I'd gone 10 rounds. And it's exactly what you were saying. You know, at face value, I'd have thought, oh, yuppie flu, chronic fatigue, it's a bit tired. It's an entirely different level. It's the worst flu combined with the worst hangover without having had the good night the night before. But combined with that, this brain fog and confusion, you can't think clearly. For me, my eyesight even sometimes begins to go, so I can't read the words on a page. And that's just a normal day. If you then overdo it, and by overdoing it I mean doing normal stuff day to day, I can easily be either stuck in the house or in my bed for a day or days on end. And indeed, this time of an afternoon, I'm actually normally laid down and usually doze off for 2 or 3 hours because the morning has been enough, and that's just from doing nothing. And then you combine that with the guilt of doing nothing, because I'm still me in my head. I want to be at work doing all the things I used to do, and you get that frustration, that guilt, that worry about what other people think. And because you look absolutely fine, it's nobody's fault, but there's very little understanding and awareness. I don't walk around with a badge on my head. Indeed, I didn't know what the badge or label was for nearly a year, but here we are, and I'm just very grateful for the chance to raise awareness of ME, and some people, as you say, call it chronic fatigue syndrome, but I think most people I've spoken to prefer ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis, because it acknowledges that this is a medical condition. There are real things, neurological and physical things happening to you, rather than the slightly broader brush chronic fatigue syndrome, which is just an umbrella of symptoms, but just feels a bit vague for some people's liking.
85058, that is the text number. I know Gary would like to hear from you as well throughout this hour, and your experiences. And it's worth sharing those experiences so that people understand. I mean, Gary, the people around you, your loved ones, when you first started to show symptoms of this, you yourself couldn't articulate, I'm sure, particularly well what was happening, although you know your body better than anybody else. It must have been very difficult for them as well.
It's incredibly difficult. I've thought before now, in the past, I've had treatment for cancer. And at the time, I said, actually, as the person undergoing the treatment, it's almost the calmest place to be because the whirlwind of medical intervention is happening around you. And the circle and sphere of worry is from friends and family around you. You are in the eye of the storm, which, as we know, is always the calmest place in the storm. And there is something similar about this, but even more difficult for my particularly friends I don't see day to day is actually being able to understand what this is, because it's quite an abstract concept to say, oh, I feel fatigued. People think that means tired. To say my body's in pain, well, we've all had a bit of pain from time to time. To say, oh, I need to lie down, we've all needed to lie down. So all of those things, but it's all of those things to the power of 10 and then some on an ongoing basis, and that's from a baseline of doing nothing. You know, if I want to then go and enjoy an evening meal with a friend or go to the cinema, which I've not been able to do for the last year because I cannot sit still for 2 hours because my body begins to lock up in too much pain. So I'm now enjoying last year's films appearing on my satellite box at home so I can sprawl around the sofa and catch up with what everybody else was doing a year ago. But it's all of those things that makes this so difficult to understand. And then when you add into this that there is no wholly agreed definition of what it is, what is ME, we don't quite know. There is no agreed treatment for this. There is no real decent amount of funding for this. And the very people who are suffering and struggling and living with this are the very people with no energy to shout the loudest. They are the hidden millions, as they're known around the world. As you mentioned, 250,000 in the UK, but millions of people around the world. And just in the past few days, I've been tweeting and sharing on Facebook and on my blog that I'm appearing here today, and Five Live has very kindly done the same on social media. I am not exaggerating. It's not dozens. It's literally hundreds of messages from strangers around the world, and I'm having to ration my time spent replying to them because that's also knackering me. But actually, the sheer frustration and upset and isolation is probably the biggest thing, which is why sitting here and saying these words right now to you is such a privilege, and I know is already making a difference.
You mentioned there the isolation. You mentioned the sense of guilt because you want to work. Perhaps a sense of uselessness as well. I don't wish to put words in your mouth.
Oh, that is the word. Seriously, uselessness is the word.
Right. So then the medical profession will look and see, of course, there's no cure currently for ME, and they will see what they can do to mitigate. What they can't do, perhaps, or probably what they don't think about immediately, is the psychological impact that it has on someone such as yourself. And how do you deal with that? I mean, you and your partner, I don't know, you're not married yet, are you? You're getting married this year?
Yeah, getting married in 1 month from now. So that's
yes.
a whole new experience of not just getting married, but realizing it will be the longest day since I fell ill where I'm meant to be on show and quote unquote performing. So I'm hoping a mixture of adrenaline and Prosecco will get me through my wedding day.
That's not a bad pairing. Not a bad
Great
pairing.
combo.
But your husband-to-be, you've said, has been a real light to you, and
Amazing.
also in many ways the only person generating a sense of positivity in your life.
Absolutely right. I'm so lucky to be marrying, I think, both the least judgmental and most understanding person I've ever met, and somebody who I suspect at times knows me better than myself, because your instinct with any illness you have in life is all about getting better, pushing through. You know, if you've had an operation on your leg, it's about physiotherapy and walking a bit more each day. These are the very things, trying to fight the illness, that actually set you back and make it worse. And that's what's very difficult to get your head round. So actually having somebody in my life who now can just give me that look, you know, when your loved one gives you that look when I'm saying, I feel fine today, I think I could go to work today, I'm going to go and walk along the seafront today and see a friend and write a blog and blah, 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 blah. And there's just that raised eyebrow. And that now is just enough to keep me in check, because as much as actually I may be able to do those things, the payback, as it's known for that, and the payback often only comes a day or two later. The payback may be days and days of being in bed, frankly, which then, of course, gives you too much time to think. And when you overthink, all those things you were talking about, the worry, the guilt, the uselessness, they set in, and of course they get exaggerated out of proportion. That's what isolation does to people, unfortunately.
How many people out there listening right now, Gary, are in love with people who save them from themselves?
Oh,
right.
we are so seriously.
Yeah,
if you are somebody with somebody like that in your life, I feel like the luckiest man on the planet right now, and to have somebody like that. I was thinking actually earlier today, if Alan wasn't in my life and wasn't there for the good times, the bad times, the utterly mundane, indifferent times, I cannot even begin to imagine it. Yes, you cope because we all develop coping mechanisms for whatever our circumstances, but having that rock, that stability, that constant in my life has proved so important. And knowing there are some people who don't have that makes this entire situation when it comes to the understanding of ME even more tragic. In fact, I go as far as to say a scandal, actually.
Over the last 15 minutes, you would have heard Gary Burgess, who's our guest takeover today, describing what it is like to live with ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome, as some know it. Now, 15 minutes in, it would be, I think, remiss of me not to ask you to ask your question of our audience. But it was important, I think, to give us that context as to why this question is so important to you. So, Gary, what is the question?
My question today is, why do we know so little about an illness which affects millions of people globally?
And there are many ways for you to get in contact with Gary this afternoon. You can give Gary a call on 08085 909 693. You can text us on 85058, tweet us at BBC5Live, or send us an email, afternoonedition@bbc.co.uk. Texts are already coming in, Gary, so people definitely want to talk to you about the issue of ME. Now, you've recorded a video diary of what life is like living with ME, so let's now have a listen to it.
Just before 9 o'clock now, and I've got a lot of pain in my body. I feel like I've done 10 rounds already because I've just been to the bathroom and got dressed. My eyes are okay. My eyes can go a bit foggy when I'm tired. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought already. Time to go and get some fresh air. I got up this morning, I went for a little walk, and I'm just absolutely beaten up. My body feels just so sore, and I'm just washed out. It's I think it's about 1:30 in the afternoon, and I've been back in bed for the past few hours, sleeping on and off, and just feeling like bleh. Well, it's just gone 7:30, really early on a chilly Thursday morning. I'm the only person here in this car park. It's actually my best time of day. So it's now 4:15. I came to bed at about midday, just after midday today. I think I've been asleep for about 3 of the past 4 hours. And this is pretty much my daily routine. A doze in the afternoon, it recharges my batteries. I can already feel the pain in my body has reduced, and this usually gives me enough energy to get me through my dinner time, and then back to bed about 8 o'clock in the evening.
You can see that video on the 5Live website, and I very much hope that you do. Gary, a beautiful text has come in for you, and it says, "It is very helpful to hear Gary explain how ME makes him feel, because my 12-year-old son has had ME for 3 years and can't vocalise how he's feeling, and it gives me, his mother, some insight." That's beautiful.
It's horrible that person is in that
Indeed.
situation, but that's wonderful to hear. It is one of those things that I feel very lucky to be able to do, and I've heard that from a number of people, that the frustration of not being able to correctly articulate what this abstract concept is. It can be like plaiting fog at times trying to explain it. So it's a real privilege to be able to do that, and I hope that provides some use for the person texting and their son as well, and hope there's some kind of improvement in the not too distant future.
So many texts coming in. I very much hope I can read as many of them to you, Gary, as possible. But why don't we know more about ME? Julia Newton is a Professor of Ageing and Medicine at Newcastle University. She's one of the UK's leading experts in ME and medical advisor to the charity Action for ME. Professor Newton, thank you for joining Gary and I this afternoon.
There's no problem at all. It's a pleasure. It was really quite touching to hear Gary's description of his experiences, because he managed to do that in a way that a lot of people, as you've said, can't put into words.
Is the medical profession together now on understanding ME?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer. I think there are significant challenges around the condition ME, which Gary described beautifully at the beginning of the interview. It's a condition that there's no consensus around the diagnostic criteria.
Well, that's a difficult place then to start from, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as a result, there are no treatments that we know from research studies are overwhelmingly effective. So until we get to a position where we can diagnose it properly and we can ensure that people are given opportunities to access effective treatments, then it's very difficult to understand a condition and put into words what an individual's experiences are of that condition.
Julia, what's the roadblock here? You know, if we were talking about a variant of a cancer, both politically and at medical expertise and research level, we'd be all over this. What's the roadblock? It strikes me it's not beyond the wit of man to say, hang on a minute, there are 250,000 people in the UK, there are millions around the world. Can we not all just get together and suss out what this is? Because I go searching online and reading various research papers, and one research paper compared to the next is almost describing an entirely different illness. We can't even agree what it is before we agree what causes it and try and fixing it.
You're absolutely right. And what it needs is researchers, clinicians, patient groups to come together in order to ensure that we can get some consensus, and that as a result we can work positively with policymakers, research funders, the NHS and other healthcare systems to make sure that we can identify this condition early and put in place strategies to manage it that we know are the best that we can possibly offer to patients.
But why? I agree with every word of that. I think anybody in this position would agree with everything you've just said. What is the block that's preventing a bunch of people getting around the table and just going, right, let's sort this?
This condition is associated with quite a considerable history. We heard you describe it as yuppie flu, and as a result, there is a lot of preconceptions about this condition, which very much influence our ability to move forward. The patients, quite rightly, and their families and the patient groups are very angry about some of the history. And as a result, there is this sort of dichotomy between clinicians, researchers and patients who often get quite angry with each other, which means that as a field we are not united. And because of that, quite reasonably, policymakers and funders will look at this as a field and say, well, you know, I have a limited pot of money, I've only got limited influence, and therefore if I have to choose where to put my money, then it's much easier in some ways to put that money into cancer, children, heart disease, when resources are limited.
So ME is in the too difficult to bother with pile compared to those other things.
I think at the moment we sometimes in this field don't help ourselves because there is often lots of challenge, lots of conflict, lots of confrontation around the name of the condition, the diagnosis, the treatment, the history, the research that's been done in the past, the funding, the policy. And as a result, we spend a lot of time in this field arguing amongst ourselves.
About semantics.
Absolutely. And what the right direction of travel ought to be and who should be leading it and what it should look like.
What's depressing about this, Professor Newton, is that reading around it, back in 2002, the then Chief Medical Officer described ME as a disease in the wilderness. From what you are saying, it seems as though we haven't moved on that far.
I think we've moved very little, and I do research as well as see patients, and it's very difficult to get funding in this field. And when you see patients who describe their experiences of the healthcare system, it makes me ashamed sometimes to be listening to what experiences people have had to endure. So, Gary's description that he made beautifully is very typical, and that, I've worked in this field since about 2002, and, I used to think that progress would be made because it was such an important topic that affected significant numbers of people.
Professor Newton, I want to bring in Heather, who's called in, because I think her description of this is going to be very powerful indeed. Heather, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Ni Hao.
Professor Newton is here and Gary is here as well. Tell us about the worst thing about ME for you.
For me, it's humiliation. I think an awful lot of people think that we are making it up, that we're pretending to be ill. I spend most of my time pretending to be well. And nobody behind the scenes sees when I hit a wall and collapse, or when I'm planning rest for 2 days or 3 days ahead of time in order to be able to go out in the evening, or the medications that I take. It's very easy for people to take a judgmental view, and that's not helped by how this disease has been represented in the media over so many years.
Do your friends see you taking the medication? Do you hide that from them?
I hide that from them. I don't want to be seen as an invalid. I didn't wake up one day 11 years ago and decide to be an invalid, and it's embarrassing. Before I was ill, I was an executive for BT, and I ran a big team of people, and I had a big budget, and I've had former colleagues baffled as to why someone who had so much drive, who was a type A personality, has now disappeared. I've more or less disappeared from my friends' lives.
Does this sound familiar, Gary?
Oh, Heather, you're describing my life as well. I wondered, I don't know what you think about this. Are we partly our own worst enemies? I think about my Facebook and Twitter and Instagram posts of my life that I share with my friends. I will share the walk in the sunshine or the occasional lunch out. The other weekend I had a few days away for our anniversary, of which I spent more than half the days in bed. But of course, I don't share those moments, and I wonder whether that's part of it, the story we tell to other people. I put my game face on, so of course people then don't see, because I don't want to post a picture of me looking dog rough in bed, or having to literally sit down after a shower in the shower because I can't climb out of the shower, or not being able to form the words in a sentence, so I'm saying the wrong things. I wonder whether, as with other illnesses where we've seen people showing their scars from operations, whether it's time for us to show the other side of life with ME. What do you think?
I find it excruciatingly embarrassing that I have in the last year started posting about it. I figure that people can't understand what's happened to me if I don't tell them.
Yeah.
And exactly what I expected to happen, which is that some people would walk away from that, has happened. But it's interesting to see the people who are still liking those posts, or commenting underneath, or signing the petitions, or really paying attention. It's not the same people I would have thought would do that. I'm also finding that more people have experiences themselves. As we're all getting older, different bits start not working, and then I get people tuning in and saying, okay, I understand where you are now, because I've got this condition which means I can't put my foot on the floor, so I've become somebody who's disabled, and the realisation hits, and as that happens, people get more sympathetic.
It's absolutely spot on. I've noticed that with my friends. Actually, most have been brilliant, by the way, before any of my friends get offended. But actually, some of the friends who I didn't expect have really stepped up and become so close, while others have just cooled off a little bit. And I can see why that would happen. Partly, I suspect it's because they don't want to overwhelm and overburden me if they think I'm constantly knackered. But I also suspect part of it is because it is so difficult to understand.
Well, Gary, there are so many texts coming in about this, people who have been living with ME for 10 years, 5 years. I'll read out as many of them as I can. Heather, thank you for sharing that. I mean, that was actually chilled me, actually, the fact that she has to hide this
But that's
from
very
her friends.
common.
Really? And this word humiliation that she
and
uses.
guilt is a common word. And frustration.
Pretending to be well when her friends, perhaps she thinks she's pretending to be ill. Eloquently put by Heather there in Lancashire. We'll come back and talk more about this. Gary Burgess is our guest takeover for today. Gary, quick reminder, what is the question you want to ask our audience here?
The question I'm asking today is, why do we know so little about an illness which affects millions of people globally?
Gary Burgess is a guest takeover today. Gary Burgess was working at his job at ITV. In fact, he was on the job when suddenly his body shut down. It took 286 days for Gary Burgess to find out what had happened to him and what had happened to his body. What was this debilitating illness that meant that just the most simple physical things would drain him of all energy? And it was ME. And Gary, if your purpose of coming on here today was to raise awareness, my gosh, you have succeeded. The amount of texts that are coming in from people who are saying that your eloquent description of how it feels to live with ME is spot on, and hopefully it will allow them to be able to tell their friends and family how they're feeling.
It means so much. I during the news switched my phone on that's otherwise on silent, and the battery is draining from the messages from strangers near and far. There's a lady who says, I'm listening in my kitchen in tears right now. She's called Helen. She said, finally somebody is describing my life, and that goes back to what I said at the outset, Nihal, which is the isolation of this. Where do you turn when you expect to go to the doctor and get an answer, and actually you get a sympathetic response, but there isn't currently an answer. You know, the approved treatment, a PACE trial, which is graded exercise therapy, encouraging people to do more and more, is so discredited. There was a debate in the Westminster Hall among MPs last week, and now official guidance is being rewritten thanks to a big intervention from the ME Association, who have just been amazing. But even then, it's going to be October 2020 before there's any new guidance, and I look into my crystal ball and predict that guidance will still be a best fit rather than an answer to a question that currently doesn't even have an answer.
Well, we heard from Heather, didn't we? And it's profoundly distressing to hear her talk about how she has to hide what she's going through from her friends. This text is coming saying people don't know about ME because even now doctors don't take seriously the patients with ME. I also hide my illness for fear of losing my job, just as I lost all my friends, says this person on the text. Someone else has texted and say, glad Gary had such a swift diagnosis. Mine took 20 years to attain in 1990, so I'm almost at the 50-year mark of this disease and have been mainly housebound since 1994, still waiting for my disease to be treated by the NHS. Just to feel a little less ill would be wonderful. Well, let's talk to Emily Beardle, who's 42 and waited more than 2 decades, and she's now a volunteer for the charity Action for ME. Emily, meet Gary, and Gary, Emily.
Hi, Gary.
Hi, Emily.
Yes, you know each other, do you already?
We do now.
No.
I feel like I know you, Emily.
Yeah.
Right, okay, good.
I feel that your description of ME just fits me spot on, so I feel like you do know me already.
Well, I mean, when did you realise, Emily, something wasn't right with your health?
Well, I was at school as a teenager, and I got recurrent chest infections and headaches daily. And I was very sporty as a teenager, and suddenly I found I couldn't run around the hockey pitch anymore because of what felt like lead legs. And I'd be trying to describe this to people, and they would say, "Oh, everyone gets achy legs when they're running around." But it wasn't the normal sort of, "Oh, I've just done some exercise, had a good workout" kind of pain. This was just nothing like that at all. I went to the doctors with all of these symptoms and was told there was nothing really wrong with me. I think they were trying to put it down to stress of my GCSEs at the time. So being quite a shy, unconfident teenager, I just sort of told myself that there obviously must be nothing wrong with me, that I'm useless and pathetic, and it really did affect my confidence a lot. And after a couple of years, I was suffering with depression as well, not surprisingly, having to kind of hide what was wrong with me and kind of just grit my teeth and get through things. And then once I had a diagnosis of depression, I found that I just wasn't listened to at all about my physical symptoms. And I think that was very easy to, depression's a very easy thing to latch onto and for doctors to blame all of this on. But for me, it was certainly the depression was a result of having the illness. And so along the way, I've had so many relapses and getting back on my feet again after losing relationships, friendships, jobs, hobbies, everything. Having to kind of reinvent myself. As I kind of say, I've had more comebacks than Madonna. I've had a very long period of not knowing what was wrong with me and putting it all down to me just being useless, really. So you can kind of see what effect that has had on me as a person growing up and as an adult as well. So I only got the diagnosis 6 years ago, and I had a severe relapse after qualifying as a pharmacist. And where it was at the point where I had to crawl to the bathroom to go to the loo, and that was all I could do all day. I couldn't feed myself properly. I couldn't get the shopping in, just the normal everyday things that you just can't do. And living on my own, that was extremely difficult. So eventually my GP, after getting very frustrated with me over several months, decided to refer me to the CFSME clinic in Leeds. But even that, it took a year to get to see the specialists.
Can I just bring Professor Newton back in for a moment, Emily? Professor Newton, what are the arguments people put forward to suggest that ME does not exist?
Well, it's difficult because ME isn't a condition that is recognised by medical professionals. So medical professionals use another name of chronic fatigue syndrome, which is what we have current guidelines, which we heard earlier in the report are currently being revised. In terms of research, to help us understand the condition, most of the research is done in the condition chronic fatigue syndrome rather than ME. So there's a lot of confusion between medical professionals and patients as to what we call this. And as a result, that sets up challenges between those two groups as to, how we can best manage it.
Is there any money in this, in the sense that, at the risk of sounding cynical, big pharma companies could find a way of monetizing? So
in order to develop a drug, which is the holy grail in CFSME research,
yes.
In order to find a treatment, to find a drug, you need to have a physiological or biological problem that you can target a drug at.
Right. And you can identify, and there is consensus that those are the symptoms. Right.
And also you need an endpoint in a trial that you can consistently show gets better. And at the moment, we don't have an endpoint. So in cancer, for example, it would be survival. In heart disease, it would be, further heart problems. Because CFS and ME are conditions that are very subjective in their nature, and there's no diagnostic test we can do in order to say whether somebody has it or doesn't have it. As a result, at the moment, it's very difficult to do drug trials.
Richard has just texted in saying, we are shouting at the radio. You have a professor, an expert. We still know nothing. What do neurological and physiological tests show? What progress has she made in 15 years? Yeah. Nothing. So far, we are just being told daily symptoms, but it's not enlightening.
Yeah. So I could talk for quite a long time about the research that we do looking at muscle function.
Alas, we do not have that
exactly.
time. Yeah.
And it is much, much more important that Gary, Heather and Emma get across the message that this is a condition that is very common and very debilitating. If people want to see my research, then please Google Julia Newton, and they will see lots of my papers that they can download and read from the internet.
There you go, Richard. There's your bedtime reading for tonight, Richard.
I was going to say, Julia, it's Gary here. Can I just, for Richard's benefit and for mine, without going into the details, is there progress when it comes to research and even defining what it is?
So we have shown using MRI scanning that there are abnormalities in heart function and muscle function that are reproducible.
Okay.
So I believe there are biological abnormalities in this condition which could be targeted by drug treatments.
Let's go into Annie, who's called in. If you want to give us a call, we've got 10 minutes left. 08085 909 693. You can also text us on 85058, as many people have been doing so. Annie, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Nihal.
Annie, do you know what? I've spoke to you so many times over the years, and we've never spoken about ME.
No, I never mention it, actually.
You don't. I knew that you were a wheelchair user. Is that right?
Yes, and I'm bedbound most of the time. I do have
We've
severe
never
ME.
spoke about this.
Well, we've always been talking about other topics.
Quite.
But, I am a bit loath to. I quite often say if a disability issue comes up on the radio and I'm talking about it, I will say I'm disabled, but I don't usually say what with. And that I think that is because of the stigma of the illness, because it really, there is still a lot of people out there who just dismiss it and think, oh, well, it's not a serious illness. It's not like, I don't know, MS or other neurological illnesses, even despite the fact that the World Health Organization have had ME categorized as a neurological illness since 1964. Mm-hmm. And our chief medical officer here in this country brought out a report in 2004 and said, yes, ME is a physical illness. It has immunological, neurological and endocrine abnormalities, and doctors must take it seriously. Unfortunately, there is real infighting in this country, and this is something really that I think Professor Newton has been slightly loath to quite say what's going on here. There is huge infighting amongst the medical profession between psychiatrists who say, oh, it's all in the mind, it's not a physical illness, and between other specialities like neurologists and immunologists who say, no, it isn't. And it is the worst country in the world to be an ME sufferer. It's the one where there is the most contention. But there has been lots of research over the years showing physical abnormalities. There's been brain scans showing that ME sufferers have abnormal blood flow to the brainstem, which is different to those of patients with depression. All sorts of research has been done over the years, but it really just kind of gets ignored because in this country there's such a huge lobby on behalf of the psychiatrists. And Professor Wesley, who did the PACE trials, his work, they've really pushed for that, and that's what NICE took up as the guidelines. And his work has really been discredited now. I'm really hoping that, something, I'm very disappointed actually that it's going to take till 2020 for those to be knocked off the NICE guidelines, because graded exercise is dangerous for people with ME.
Okay, Annie is spot on.
Okay, Annie, thank you for doing that. And I should really get Professor Newton to come back on this, but we are running out of time. Now, one person who Gary really wanted to speak to as part of this guest takeover is Jennifer Brea, who's made a film which was longlisted for an Oscar about living with ME. Now, here's part of the trailer for Unrest.
From as early as I can remember, I wanted to swallow the world whole. Anything was possible. I just thought I would have more time.
I don't know what I did to myself. I don't think I can get up off the couch. I feel like my brain is misfiring.
Sometimes I wouldn't be able to speak.
Wow.
If you say too little, they can't help you. And if you say too much, they think you're a mental patient.
The doctor would tell me, you're just dehydrated. Everyone gets stressed. And I went online and found thousands of other people just like me.
Yeah, I'm completely bedridden.
It's like I'm just watching my life disappear.
I have ME, CFS, that's chronic fatigue syndrome.
And Jennifer Brea, who made Unrest, is with us now. Gary, I should leave it over to you and Jennifer to have this conversation. Good afternoon, Jennifer. Thanks for joining us on the BBC.
Thank you so much for having me.
Gary.
Jennifer, I watched Unrest, and it was the first time that I was watching my life reflected back at me. I was in floods of tears, but it opened my world to this. I just wonder, from your perspective, why did you make this documentary in the first place?
Well, I had a similar experience of just sort of having my world opened early in my illness. I got sick about 7 years ago when I was in graduate school, and doctors had no idea what was wrong with me. And so I think for a long time I thought I just had a rare disease, maybe something that no one had ever seen. And it was really going online and meeting thousands of people all over the world, a subset of the millions who are affected, and many people who had been homebound or bedbound for decades, and realizing that there was this whole community of people who shared my symptoms, and that we were all struggling to be believed and to get the access to medical care and research that we needed. And it was really then that I kind of started to conceive of this as a social justice issue, and wanted to make a film to try to bring the public, our families, as well as doctors and scientists, into our homes and bedrooms and into the experience of what it really is to live with this.
Isn't it obscene? And I hope one day it will look back and people will see it as a scandal that you're having to do this so that people can be believed in the first place. Do you, so far, and you've been around the world beating the drum for this, do you feel you have made a difference? And if so, how and where?
Well, it's interesting. I think even the people closest to us sometimes don't understand what it is to live with this, because unless you live in the home, it is a very hard disease to understand. It's a really deceptive condition because so many of us who are well enough to be in public, you only see us when we're well. You don't see us, a few hours later or the next day when we crash and we're in bed, sensitive to light and sound, unable to move or get about. And so, and for 25% of people who are homebound or bedridden, you never see us at all. And so I think, I believe that if you could show the true experience of this illness, things would really have to start to change. And I see that happening all over the world. I've seen families support their loved one in new ways. There was even a family in India where someone moved back across country to go and take care of someone who they had left because they sort of started to understand just sort of what this condition really was. I've seen, new clinicians, new doctors get interested in learning how to diagnose this condition, which is actually fairly easy to diagnose, with the new criteria that we have in the U.S. And I've seen, new scientists get interested in the field. And so that's been really encouraging. And so, we're on Netflix now. We had a broadcast in the U.S. There's been literally millions of people who've seen the film, and it is really starting to change the conversation. And this next year, I'm looking forward to really trying to bring this film to medical schools, to doctors, and to universities around the world to really bring new clinicians and scientists into the field.
Jennifer, thank you for joining us. Jennifer Bray there, who made Unrest. I think it's very important, we've only got a minute or so, to talk to Hazel Royal from Watson Burton, who's an employment law specialist, about this. Hazel, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Nihal.
Very, very quickly, unfortunately, you're squeezing you in, but you're so important to us. Hazel, what rights do employees have if they go to their employer and say they think they have ME?
So this is a really difficult one because I think you're talking a lot today about that challenge of getting that diagnosis. And in fact, in employment law terms, that diagnosis is quite crucial, because what we're looking for from the employee perspective to get protection is you need to be covered by the Equality Act and to be actually deemed to be disabled. Now, it's not really your kind of GP or treating clinician who gives you that kind of diagnosis, if you like. Well, obviously they give the diagnosis of ME, but it's not them that defines you as disabled. But we do have legal criteria that you have to meet, and only once you've met those criteria do you have any protection at all.
My gosh. Gary, you've had a huge amount of interest in what you've talked about today. So for now, we're nowhere near the end of this journey, but for now, at least we've opened up a big conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. And I know a lot of people will feel exactly the same, Nihal.
BBC 5 Live.